It's funny how life can take a sharp turn when you least expect it. One minute you're coasting through your daily routine, comfortable in the rhythm of your life, and the next, everything you thought you knew is thrown out the window. That's exactly what happened to Mark. Mark was a 34-year-old guy living in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago. He had always prided himself on living an uncomplicated life. His job in IT had been steady and paid the bills, but more than that, it allowed him the time and space to enjoy life's simpler pleasures. He had a home, a wife, and like any typical guy, he believed he had a pretty solid understanding of how everything worked. His wife, Emily, was the kind of woman who everyone seemed to admire. She was smart, confident, and had a way of making everyone around her feel important. She worked as a freelance marketing consultant, which allowed her to set her own schedule, and Mark had always appreciated that about her. It meant they could spend time together, go on weekend getaways, and have lazy mornings on the couch without the stress of a 9-to-5 job. They weren't perfect, of course, no marriage ever is. There had been small, occasional disagreements, but nothing that ever seemed insurmountable. Emily's occasional late nights working on her projects didn't raise any red flags for Mark. She was just dedicated to her career. After all, he did the same with his job in tech. They both made sacrifices for their goals, but they balanced it well. The story, though, takes a darker turn when Mark returns home early from work one Friday afternoon, hoping to surprise Emily with dinner from her favorite restaurant. It's been a long week for both of them, and he thought it might be nice to rekindle their usual Friday night tradition. He couldn't wait to see the smile on her face when he walked through the door. As he pulled into the driveway, Mark felt a strange sense of unease, but he brushed it off. It was probably just the exhaustion from the week, he thought. He parked the car, grabbed the takeout bag, and walked up the front steps. But as soon as he reached for the doorknob, he froze. The sounds inside the house were off. Mark could hear voices, but they weren't Emily's. His heart skipped a beat, and his mind immediately began to race. He pushed the door open slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, unsure of what he was about to walk into. He stepped inside and set the bag of food down on the entryway table. The voices grew louder as he crept down the hallway, towards the living room. Then he heard a laugh that wasn't Emily's. "Is everything okay?" he heard Emily ask, a note of concern in her voice. "It's fine," a man's voice responded, followed by a soft chuckle. The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood up. He wasn't sure why, but something told him he needed to take a closer look. He moved slowly toward the living room, careful not to make a sound. As he reached the doorframe, he peered inside, and there they were, Emily, sitting on the couch, laughing at something the man beside her had said. It wasn't an unusual sight. Mark had seen her laugh with friends before, but what struck him wasn't just the man sitting beside her. It was the way they were sitting so close, the way their eyes locked together, and the undeniable chemistry in the air. It wasn't anything overt, but it didn't have to be. Mark knew something was wrong. As he stood there, paralyzed with a growing sense of dread, the man put his hand on Emily's shoulder in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. Mark didn't even realize he was holding his breath until he saw Emily tilt her head toward the man, as though they were about to share a private joke. That was when the world tilted. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the noise deafening in his ears. This wasn't right. This wasn't the Emily he thought he knew. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. And then the thought hit him, sharp and clear. She was cheating on me. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face, his body going cold despite the warmth of the house. He didn't know what to do, what to say. His mind was spinning in a million directions. Should he confront her now? Should he walk out and pretend like he hadn't seen anything? But before he could make a move, Emily turned toward him. Her eyes widened in shock when she saw him standing there, frozen in the doorway, her expression shifting from surprise to something harder to read. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you doing here?" Mark's breath hitched in his throat as he looked from Emily to the man beside her. The man didn't even have the decency to look away. Instead, he gave Mark a half-smile, clearly unfazed by the situation. Mark's fists clenched at his sides, the urge to lash out growing with every passing second. "I thought I'd surprise you with dinner," Mark managed to say, his voice hoarse. "But it looks like you're already entertained." Emily's face flushed, and she stood up quickly, her hands reaching out as though to explain. But Mark held up a hand, stopping her before she could say anything else. "Don't. Just don't." His voice cracked as the anger and hurt mixed together. "I saw enough." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Mark could feel his world crumbling around him, and yet, he was still standing there, unable to process what had just happened. This was the woman he had married. This was the woman he had trusted with everything. And now, she was sitting there, looking at him like she had done nothing wrong. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but Mark shook his head, turning away before she could say another word. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel, but the only thing he could think about was the fact that everything he thought he knew had been a lie. And as he walked toward the door, he couldn't help but wonder, how had he missed all the signs? Had he been so blind to the cracks in their marriage? Or was it just easier to ignore the small things, to keep pretending everything was fine? One thing was for sure. Mark was about to find out what it truly meant to face the truth. The cold air outside didn't match the fire that was burning inside Mark. He couldn't bring himself to go back into the house. Not yet. He needed time, space, maybe even a bit of distance to figure out what the hell had just happened. And the more he thought about it, the harder it became to make sense of it all. As Mark stood there on the porch, looking out into the quiet night, his mind was in turmoil. He had always prided himself on being a steady, reliable guy. He took pride in the way he built his life with Emily, the way they'd planned their future together, the long conversations about dreams, kids, and where they'd live. He had never imagined in a million years that something like this could happen. But there it was, staring him in the face. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the realization that he had been living in a lie for who knows how long. Emily hadn't just made one mistake. She had built a whole new life without him in it. And the worst part? She didn't even seem to feel sorry about it. The man on the couch, the one who was so comfortable with Emily, had he been around for a while? Had he always been there, and Mark had just ignored the signs? How many nights had she been spending with him? Was this her idea of fun? Or was it something deeper? Mark wasn't sure how much time passed before he finally got back into his car and drove away from the house. His heart was still heavy, but he knew he needed answers. As he sat behind the wheel, his mind was racing, but he didn't want to make any rash decisions. What's the next step? And then it hit him. He wasn't just a victim in this situation. He was a man who still had control over his life. Emily thought she could keep her secrets, but she was wrong. Mark wasn't going to be the guy who sat idly by, waiting for answers to fall into his lap. He was going to take control of the situation and make decisions for himself. But he didn't know what he was doing yet. He didn't know how to confront Emily, how to deal with the man in the living room, or if he should just walk away completely. One thing was clear though. His world had been flipped upside down, and he was going to need time to figure it out. The next morning, Mark decided to call in sick to work. The last thing he wanted was to go back to his office, act like everything was normal, and pretend he hadn't just found his wife in the arms of another man. It would be impossible to focus on anything that day. Instead, he spent hours pacing around his house, looking at the furniture, the photos on the walls, and the things they'd bought together over the years. How had it all come to this? He was no fool. Mark knew that the answers weren't going to come from Emily alone. No, he needed to dig deeper. He needed to understand why this had happened, what went wrong, and if there was any chance of salvaging their marriage. Could he even trust her again? Could he ever look at her the same way? His mind went back to that moment when he'd seen Emily and the other man laughing on the couch, the way they looked at each other like no one else existed. That bond, that connection, it wasn't something that just happened overnight. This had been brewing for a long time. Mark had just been too blind, too focused on the mundane to see it. He knew he couldn't sit around forever. He had to make a decision. But before confronting Emily again, Mark needed to see her. He needed to hear her side of the story, even if he wasn't sure he'd believe it. He wasn't going to get the closure he needed by pretending like nothing had happened. So, when the afternoon rolled around, he grabbed his keys and drove back to the house. As he pulled into the driveway, the house looked so ordinary, almost mocking in its normalcy. He took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. It wasn't easy, but he knew it was time. Inside, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her back turned to him. She hadn't heard him come in. He paused for a moment, watching her, trying to gather his thoughts. The silence was deafening. When she finally turned around, her face went pale. She stood up quickly, almost knocking over the chair in the process. "Mark, you came back." "I came back because we need to talk," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of frustration. "I saw enough last night, Emily. I don't even know where to begin." Emily's expression faltered as she reached for her coffee cup, gripping it tightly in her hands. "Mark, Don't, Emily. Don't try to explain. I already know what's been going on." "I saw you. I heard you," Mark interrupted, his voice growing louder. "You were with him, laughing, acting like everything was fine. You don't think I noticed? Do you think I'm that stupid?" Her face flushed red, her eyes brimming with tears, but she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." Mark laughed bitterly. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Really? How long has this been going on? Emily? How long have you been seeing him behind my back?" "Mark, please. I'm done with the excuses, Emily. You've made your choice," he said coldly. "I don't need to hear any more." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but Mark wasn't ready to hear it. He was too angry, too hurt, and too betrayed. He turned around and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind him. He wasn't sure what he wanted, but one thing was clear. He wasn't staying in that house another minute. It wasn't about revenge anymore, not really. It was about closure. It was about him walking away, taking back control of his life. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but he knew one thing. It was time for a change. Before we continue with the next step, remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more cheating wife stories. Let me know your thoughts below. As the story progresses, tensions between the characters continue to rise. The central conflict is now undeniably in full swing. Betrayal has been revealed, and the consequences are beginning to unfold. But let's take a moment to dive deeper into our protagonist's emotional journey. Remember, our protagonist, Greg, has been reeling from discovering his wife, Lisa, in bed with his best friend, Tom. First, it was disbelief, then anger. But now, Greg is starting to realize that this isn't just an emotional betrayal. It's a personal one, shaking the very foundation of his life. The air in the house has been thick with the tension that has built up since the night of the discovery. It's been a week now, but Greg is struggling to move forward. Lisa has apologized a dozen times, each more desperate than the last. But for Greg, it's all just noise. He can't shake the image of them together, the way they looked at each other with that intimacy that was supposed to belong to him. And the guilt, oh, the guilt. It gnaws at him every day as he tries to navigate the pain and confusion. This morning, as Greg sits on the edge of their bed, the room feels like it's closing in on him. The faint smell of Lisa's perfume still lingers in the air, even though she's been gone for the last few hours. She had promised to meet with Tom, trying to fix things with him, she said, but Greg didn't believe it. He had heard all the excuses before. He was just a friend, it was just a one-time thing, we made a mistake. Yet, the cracks in their relationship seemed too big to repair, and Greg was beginning to think that maybe it was time to let go. The first turning point came when Greg decided to confront Tom. He had been avoiding it for days, paralyzed by the idea of facing his betrayer. But deep down, Greg knew he couldn't move forward without addressing it. He had to know the truth. Not just Lisa's side of the story, but Tom's as well. Tom was the last person Greg ever imagined would betray him. They had been friends for over a decade, sharing everything from childhood memories to the toughest moments of adulthood. Tom had always been there for Greg, or so Greg thought. Now, the idea that Tom had crossed the line in such a way, right under his nose, seemed impossible. But here they were, and Greg had to face him. Tom's office was quiet when Greg arrived, tucked away in the corner of the city's industrial district. The building looked old, worn down, a far cry from the sleek modern offices most successful businessmen seemed to favor. It was almost fitting, though. Their friendship had always been grounded in simplicity. Never flashy, never extravagant. Greg walked up to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He knocked sharply, the sound echoing down the empty hall. He didn't wait for an answer, just turned the knob and pushed the door open. Tom looked up from his desk, his face briefly showing the surprise of seeing Greg there unannounced. Then it was quickly masked, replaced by a look of uneasy calm. "Greg," he said, standing up, "I wasn't expecting you." Greg didn't waste any time. "We need to talk." Tom sighed, and for a moment, there was a flash of guilt in his eyes. But he quickly covered it up with his usual bravado. "About what? We've been over this already." Greg's jaw clenched. "We haven't even scratched the surface." The next few minutes were a blur of accusations, frustration, and confusion. Greg wanted answers. He needed to know why Tom had done it, why he had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Tom's response was predictable but no less infuriating. He claimed it was a moment of weakness, that it wasn't meant to happen, that he never intended to hurt Greg. But Greg wasn't buying it. It was clear that Tom wasn't sorry, not really. He regretted getting caught, yes, but the act itself? It didn't seem to faze him the way it had shattered Greg. As the conversation progressed, Greg's anger began to rise. But it wasn't just anger at Tom anymore. It was anger at himself. Anger at his own naivety. Anger at the years he had wasted trusting the wrong people. By the time Greg left Tom's office, he was fuming. The betrayal had cut deeper than he'd ever anticipated. But now, it was time for action. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about taking control of his life again. Greg needed to confront Lisa. He needed to get her side of the story, and more importantly, figure out where they stood. He couldn't let the silence stretch any longer. It was suffocating him. But as much as he wanted to scream, to confront her with everything, he also realized that he was still in love with her, despite everything. His heart told him one thing, but his mind knew better. There were too many unanswered questions, and the truth had to come out. The confrontation took place that evening, after Lisa returned home. She had been quiet, almost distant, throughout the day. Greg could sense that something was weighing on her, but he knew better than to let her control the conversation. He was done being the victim. The moment Lisa stepped inside, Greg was already waiting for her in the living room. His arms were crossed, and his expression was unreadable, the mask of calm he'd perfected over the years. "Greg, we need to talk," Lisa began, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg didn't say a word. He just nodded, motioning for her to sit down. The tension was unbearable. Both of them knew what was coming. Lisa took a deep breath, gathering the strength to speak, but Greg wasn't going to let her off the hook this time. He needed answers, and he was going to get them whether she was ready or not. "Lisa," he started, his voice steady. "Why?" She looked away, clearly avoiding his gaze. "Greg, it's not that simple." "Oh, it's that simple," he shot back. "You cheated on me with Tom, my best friend. I need to understand how this happened. How you let this happen." Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. Greg's heart twinged at the sight, but he quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't the time for sympathy. This was the time for truth. As Lisa finally began to explain, Greg realized that this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about something much deeper. She talked about how their marriage had become distant over time, how she had felt neglected, and how Tom had been there when Greg wasn't. But that didn't make it right. And deep down, Lisa knew that. She had betrayed him, not just physically but emotionally as well. The conversation was a turning point for both of them. For Lisa, it was a painful admission of her mistakes. For Greg, It was the beginning of reclaiming control over his life. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could decide what came next. As they sat there, the weight of everything between them felt almost too much to bear. The air was heavy with unspoken words, with guilt and regret hanging in the space between them. But there was also something else, something that neither of them could ignore, the need to move forward. As Greg sits across from Lisa, the air between them feels unbearably thick with tension. It's as if the weight of the entire conversation is pressing down on him, and he can barely breathe. He's been listening to her explanation, but nothing she says seems to make sense. He's heard it all before. It was a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was lonely. But none of that makes the situation any better. Nothing will undo the hurt, the betrayal, the anger that has been festering inside him for days. As Lisa speaks, her voice cracks, and Greg can see the guilt written all over her face. She's not crying, but he can feel her pain. It's the kind of pain that comes from knowing you've made an irreversible decision, the kind of pain that she can't take back, no matter how many apologies she offers. "I'm sorry, Greg. I should have communicated better," she says, her eyes filled with regret. "I never meant for things to go this far. I don't know what happened. I got caught up in everything. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Greg clenches his fists, trying to keep his composure. He wants to scream, to demand that she explain herself, to get every little detail of how this all came to be. But he holds back. Part of him is afraid that if he lets it all out, he won't be able to stop. So instead, he asks the question that has been haunting him for days. "Why Tom?" His voice is strained, and the words feel like they're tearing him apart as they leave his mouth. "Why not someone else? Why did it have to be my best friend?" Lisa shifts uncomfortably in her seat, unable to meet his gaze. "It just happened. I don't know. I guess I always thought that Tom would understand me better than anyone else." Greg's heart skips a beat at her words. She had always claimed that Tom was like family, but this felt like a slap in the face. Tom, the man who had shared countless hours with him, his confidant, his friend. And now this? It was too much to bear. "Is that really all it was?" Greg asks, his voice low, trembling. "Was it just that simple?" Lisa opens her mouth to respond, but before she can say anything, Greg stands up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He can't sit there anymore, listening to the endless stream of excuses. His stomach churns, and the weight of everything crashes down on him all at once. "I need space," Greg says, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this right now. I need to think. I need time to process all of this." Lisa's face falls, and for a moment, Greg almost feels sorry for her. But then he remembers what she's done, what she's taken from him, and the sympathy fades. He turns to leave, but before he reaches the door, Lisa calls out to him. "Greg, please don't walk away from me," she says, her voice pleading. "We can fix this. We can work through it together." But Greg knows better now. There's no fixing this. Not right now. Maybe not ever. His trust has been shattered beyond repair, and no amount of words will change that. He leaves the house, his mind racing as he steps out into the night. The cool air hits his face like a slap, but it does nothing to calm the storm inside him. He feels lost, adrift, unsure of where to go or what to do next. All he knows is that he needs to get away from Lisa, from everything that reminds him of the pain and betrayal. Greg drives aimlessly, letting the road take him wherever it may. His thoughts swirl in a chaotic mess, but one thing is clear. He can't stay in this town anymore. He can't stay where everything is tainted by the memories of what happened. As he drives, the tension continues to build, each passing mile taking him further away from the life he once knew. His mind keeps drifting back to Lisa, to Tom, to the life they had shared. He wonders how it all went so wrong, how they ended up here, trapped in a cycle of lies and deceit. Hours pass and Greg finds himself on a quiet highway, the road stretching out endlessly before him. He pulls over to the side, his hands shaking as he grips the steering wheel. The silence is deafening, but it also gives him a moment to think. A moment to decide what he's going to do next. His phone buzzes on the passenger seat, and he glances at it, his heart sinking when he sees that it's a message from Lisa. He doesn't read it. Instead, he grabs the phone, turns it off, and tosses it into the back seat. He doesn't want to hear from her. Not right now. Maybe not ever. The world outside is dark, and the headlights of passing cars illuminate the road ahead in sharp bursts. Greg feels like he's in a dream, suspended in time. He doesn't know where he's going, but he knows he has to keep moving forward. He has to leave it all behind. The next morning, Greg arrives in a small town several hours away. It's not much, just a few shops and a diner on the corner, but it feels like the fresh start he's been looking for. He checks into a rundown motel and spends the day wandering the streets, lost in thought. He tries to clear his head, to make sense of everything that's happened, but it's impossible. The pain is too raw, too fresh. Later that night, Greg finds himself sitting in the dimly lit diner, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to distract himself from the overwhelming emotions that threaten to engulf him. The waitress, a friendly older woman, strikes up a conversation, but Greg barely responds. He's not interested in small talk, not interested in anything other than finding a way out of this nightmare. As he stares into his coffee, his mind races again, and the full weight of what's happened hits him. His marriage, his friendship, everything he thought he knew. It's all been ripped away in a single moment. And now, as he sits alone in this diner, he realizes that he has no idea what's next. Is he ready to face Lisa again? Is he ready to confront Tom? Or is he better off starting over completely? This section introduces even more conflict and builds up the tension as Greg wrestles with his emotions and decisions. The story is now entering the most pivotal moments, setting up for the climax. Would you like to continue with the next part, or make adjustments? Let me know. Greg spends the night at the small motel, tossing and turning in a bed that feels too big, too empty. He's far from home, but no matter how many miles he puts between himself and Lisa, the memories keep haunting him. Every time he closes his eyes, he sees her face, hears her voice, and feels that crushing weight of betrayal all over again. His mind races, his thoughts spiraling with questions, anger, and confusion. It's all he can do to not go insane. The quiet town seems like the perfect place to get some distance, but in truth, it feels suffocating. He needs answers, but no amount of time or space seems to be enough to numb the pain. He decides to step outside, the cool air a welcome relief from the suffocating heat of his thoughts. He walks through the small streets, letting the rhythm of his footsteps calm his nerves, though the tightness in his chest never fully subsides. It's as if the whole world is moving forward, and he's stuck, frozen in a moment of his life that he can't shake. As he rounds a corner, he sees a familiar figure, a man he recognizes from his time back home. It's Tom. Greg's stomach churns at the sight of his old best friend. He freezes for a moment, unsure whether to approach or turn and walk away. But Tom, oblivious to the storm raging inside Greg, approaches him with a broad smile, the kind of grin that used to be so comforting, so genuine, the kind of grin that Greg would have returned in an instant. "Greg," Tom says enthusiastically, clapping him on the back. "Man, it's been a while. How've you been?" For a second, Greg is too stunned to speak. How can Tom act like everything is normal after what he's done? The betrayal, the lies, they all come rushing back in a flood of rage. But there's something else too, something Greg didn't expect. Guilt. Guilt that he hasn't confronted Tom yet. Guilt that he hasn't torn into him like he should have. I'm fine," Greg finally says, his voice colder than he intends. "What the hell are you doing here?" Tom's smile falters for just a split second, but he quickly recovers, shrugging as if it's no big deal. "I was in town for business. Figured I'd check in. You know? See how things are going. You've been out of touch lately. Everything all right with you?" Everything is not all right. Everything is completely and utterly wrong. The words are on the tip of Greg's tongue, but they won't come out. He can't seem to say what he wants to say, can't quite find the strength to confront Tom the way he needs to. Instead, he just nods, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides. Tom seems oblivious to Greg's internal battle. "You're looking good, man," he continues. "You've been keeping busy?" Greg's response is sharp, cutting through the small talk like a knife. "Yeah, I've been busy. Too busy to deal with things back home." Tom raises an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "What's that supposed to mean?" Greg stands there for a moment, silent, his mind racing. He can't just walk away. Not now, not when everything is so close to the surface. He's done being polite. He's done pretending like nothing happened. "I know what you did," Greg finally says, the words coming out in a rush. "I know everything, Tom." Tom's face falls, the smile slipping from his lips as Greg's words land with the force of a punch. For a moment, there's only silence between them. The air feels thick with tension, and Greg feels a surge of something. Anger, perhaps, or maybe just the sheer weight of having said it aloud. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tom says quietly, his voice tense, defensive. Greg can't help but let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, really? You don't know what I'm talking about? Don't pretend, Tom. I know about you and Lisa. I know everything." Tom shifts uncomfortably, avoiding Greg's eyes. "Look, Greg, Save it," Greg interrupts, his voice shaking with emotion. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't care why you did it. I just can't believe you would do this to me. After everything we've been through." Tom opens his mouth, but Greg doesn't give him a chance to speak. "You think I didn't notice? The way you two started hanging out more, the way you'd both go out for drinks and come back acting all weird? I wasn't stupid, Tom. I just didn't want to believe it. But now I don't know what to think." Tom looks down, his shoulders sagging with shame. He doesn't say anything at first, and Greg can feel his heart racing, the intensity of the moment building to a boiling point. There's no turning back now. "You know what?" Greg says, his voice steady, but his eyes burning with rage. "I've had enough. I don't need this. I don't need you. I'm done." Greg turns on his heel, walking away from Tom without another word. He doesn't look back, but he can feel the weight of Tom's gaze on his back, heavy and full of regret. The whole world feels like it's crashing down on him, but he doesn't stop. He can't. He needs to leave this all behind. As he walks through the small town, Greg's mind is a whirlwind of emotions. He's angry, hurt, betrayed, but above all, he's done. He can't go back to the life he had before. It's over. Lisa, Tom, everything that once felt safe, comfortable, familiar, is now gone, shattered beyond repair. Greg knows that this is the point of no return. The turning point, the moment when everything changes. He feels the weight of it settling deep into his bones. The confrontation with Tom is over, but the aftermath, the consequences, are just beginning. The choices he makes from here on out will define the rest of his life. And as much as it hurts, as much as he wants to scream, to lash out, he knows that this is the only way forward. There's no going back now. The stage is set for the final act, with the confrontation between Greg and Tom escalating the tension and setting up the critical moments to come. Would you like to continue with the next section, or make adjustments? Let me know. Greg's heart races as he walks away from Tom, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He knows he can't keep running, not from this. The world around him feels like it's closing in, but he refuses to acknowledge the familiar pang of betrayal that gnaws at him. As Greg takes long strides down the dusty street, the sound of his boots hitting the ground echoes like a clock ticking down to the inevitable. He hasn't felt this alive in days, but also more terrified than ever. The confrontation with Tom has unleashed something inside him that he wasn't prepared for. His mind spirals, and it feels like the universe is testing him, pushing him further into the chaos. What does he do now? Where does he go from here? He's angry, but there's also this deep emptiness, like a part of him has died with the trust he thought he had in his best friend and his wife. For a moment, he almost lets himself fall into despair, but then something catches his eye. A small cafe at the end of the street. The warm light spilling from the windows feels like an oasis, and he can't resist the pull. He walks toward it, hands trembling, his mind a whirlpool of unanswered questions. As he enters the cafe, the bell above the door rings, announcing his arrival. The smell of fresh coffee fills the air, mixing with the rich scent of baked goods. It's a cozy, intimate space, the kind of place where people come to share a moment of peace. But for Greg, peace feels like a distant memory. He sits down at an empty table, his eyes scanning the room, not really seeing anything. His mind keeps returning to the conversation with Tom. The betrayal, the lies, the idea that everyone around him, his closest friends, the woman he thought he'd spend his life with, had been hiding something from him. How long had this been going on? How many secrets had they kept from him? His thoughts are interrupted when the waitress approaches, a friendly smile on her face. She seems like she's been working here for years, comfortable in her role as the calm presence in the midst of the chaos. "What can I get for you?" she asks, her voice soft and soothing. Greg doesn't immediately respond, still lost in his own thoughts. He forces a smile, though it doesn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll have a coffee. Black," he mutters, his voice low, rough. The waitress nods, takes his order, and leaves him to his thoughts. As he sits there, his mind drifts to Lisa, his wife, his partner, the one person he trusted above all else. He wants to scream, to punch the walls, to do something, anything, but the reality is too suffocating. He's stuck, standing at the crossroads of his life, and he has no idea which path to take. The coffee arrives, steaming hot, and Greg wraps his hands around the mug, trying to find some comfort in the warmth. The bitterness of the coffee matches the bitterness in his chest. He stares into the dark liquid, as if it might hold the answers he's searching for. That's when it hits him, the real weight of everything. It's not just about Tom and Lisa anymore. It's about everything. His life, his choices, his future. What's next? Can he ever go back to what he had before? Can he rebuild the trust that's been shattered into a million pieces? He knows he needs to confront Lisa, to figure out what happened, but part of him dreads it. What if she tries to justify it? What if she tells him it's all just a misunderstanding, that he's overreacting? He knows he won't be able to live with himself if he doesn't get the truth, but the truth might destroy him even more than it already has. He sits there for what feels like an eternity, lost in his thoughts, until the door to the cafe opens again. He glances up, and his heart skips a beat. It's Lisa. She stands there, looking uncertain, her eyes scanning the room until they land on Greg. For a moment, the world seems to freeze. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know if he should run, confront her, or just walk away. His body tenses, and for a split second, he contemplates leaving, just walking out the door and never looking back. But something keeps him rooted to the spot. Lisa steps forward, her movements hesitant. She looks as if she's come here with the intention of talking, but she's unsure if Greg is even willing to hear her out. She doesn't sit down immediately, instead hovering by the chair opposite him. "Greg," she says softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Can we talk?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She wants to talk. Of course she does. But what's left to say? What could possibly make this right again? He takes a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. His grip tightens on the coffee mug, but he doesn't let go. "Sure," he replies, his voice distant. He knows this conversation is inevitable. They need to clear the air, for better or worse. He just hopes he can survive it. Lisa sits down carefully, as if the weight of the moment might crush her. She looks at him, her eyes filled with an emotion he can't quite place. Regret? Guilt? Or maybe something else. Something darker, something more complicated. "I never wanted to hurt you, Greg," she begins, her voice fragile. "You have to believe me." The words don't land the way she intends. They sound hollow to Greg, like an empty apology meant to smooth things over, but lacking any real depth. "Then why, Lisa?" he asks, his voice breaking slightly. "Why would you do this? Why would you betray me with Tom?" Lisa looks down, her hands twisting together in her lap. She's silent for a moment, and Greg wonders if she's trying to come up with some explanation, some excuse that could somehow make this all make sense. "It wasn't like that," she finally says, her voice quiet. "It wasn't planned, Greg. I never meant for it to happen, but it did. And I don't know how to fix it. Greg shakes his head. You can't fix it, Lisa. You can't just undo what's been done. The weight of the words hangs heavy in the air between them. There's nothing she can say to make it better. Nothing she can do to repair the damage. Not now. Not after everything. Greg stands up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as he pushes it back. Lisa flinches at the sound, but Greg doesn't notice. He's too far gone in his own anger and pain. I can't do this anymore, he says, his voice firm, though it cracks slightly with emotion. I need to get away from you. From all of this. Lisa stands as well, reaching out to him. Greg, please, don't leave. We can work this out. Please. But Greg is already walking toward the door, every step heavy with the finality of it all. He doesn't look back, doesn't even say another word. He just walks out into the cold, night air, determined to leave the past behind him. And as he disappears into the darkness, Lisa stands there, lost and broken, knowing that she may never be able to undo the damage she's caused. The stage is set. Greg's confrontation with Lisa has left the air thick with unresolved tension. He's made his choice, but the fallout is far from over. The rising conflict has reached its peak, and everything is about to change. The story is now headed toward its emotional climax. Greg walks down the dimly lit street, his mind spinning, the weight of his decisions settling over him like a heavy blanket. He knows there's no going back, not after what he's seen, what he's heard, and what's been broken. His life, his world, has just been ripped apart, and though a part of him wants to run, to hide from it all, he knows he can't. There's nowhere to run when the truth comes crashing down. The cold wind bites at his skin as he pulls his jacket tighter around him, but it's nothing compared to the icy emptiness in his chest. The weight of betrayal is suffocating, and even though he's made the choice to leave, he can't shake the nagging thought that somehow, he's the one who's failed. Failed to see it coming. Failed to hold it all together. Failed to trust the people he loved most. For a moment, he wonders if he's made the right choice. Could he have fixed things with Lisa? Could they have rebuilt their relationship? But then the image of her with Tom flashes in his mind, and he knows. The answer is no. No matter how hard he tries to convince himself, it's too late. They've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. But still, there's a part of him that aches to hold on to something, to not lose it all. The life they had together, the dream of a future they'd once shared. But in the quiet of his thoughts, Greg knows deep down that it was never really his to begin with. His relationship with Lisa was built on a shaky foundation, and now that the cracks have been exposed, the whole thing is crumbling. Greg's phone buzzes in his pocket, breaking his train of thought. He pulls it out, and for a split second he debates ignoring it. But something stops him. It's a message from his lawyer, Lawrence. With a sigh, he opens it. I've moved the bulk of your funds into offshore accounts, as discussed. Your wife will have access to the monthly allowance you requested. I recommend keeping a low profile until things cool down. Let me know if you need anything else. Greg feels a flicker of relief. At least something is going according to plan. He won't have to worry about money, and Lisa will be taken care of financially. Still, it doesn't make the pain any easier to bear. He pockets the phone and continues walking. The city seems so much quieter now, as if everything has fallen silent in response to the storm raging inside him. But as much as he wants to retreat into solitude, to shut out the world, he knows he can't hide forever. He's going to have to face the consequences of his decisions eventually. Greg makes his way to the small park near his apartment. The sound of his footsteps on the cracked pavement is the only noise around, the city feeling abandoned in its own way. The benches are empty, the trees bare of leaves, as if the whole world is holding its breath. For a moment he thinks about sitting down, maybe trying to think things through, but then he sees her. Lisa. She's standing in the middle of the park, looking lost. She's holding her phone in her hand, and for a moment, Greg wonders if she's been trying to reach him. The thought stirs something in his chest. Anger, sadness, confusion. But he doesn't approach her. He just stands there, watching her, unsure of what to do. Lisa turns and spots him, her face softening with recognition. She starts walking toward him, but Greg doesn't move. He can't. Not yet. She reaches him, her voice trembling as she speaks. Greg, I didn't know where else to go. I thought I could fix this. I thought, maybe we could still fix this. Greg's breath catches in his throat, and for a moment he's torn. The temptation to hold her, to pretend that everything's okay, is almost overwhelming. But then he remembers everything. The betrayal, the lies, the broken trust. And in that moment, he knows that there's no going back. Lisa, he says, his voice steady, though it's laced with pain. You don't get it. You don't get to come here and pretend like this is something that can be fixed. You made your choices, and now I have to make mine. She steps back, her face crumbling, and Greg can see the hurt in her eyes. The same hurt he's feeling, but also the realization that she's not the one in control anymore. For the first time in a long time, Greg feels a sense of clarity. He's not the one broken in this moment. I'm sorry, she whispers, and it sounds so empty, so meaningless after everything that's happened. I don't know what else to say. Greg looks at her one last time, and then, without another word, he turns and walks away. His steps are slow, but they're sure. He knows that leaving this behind is the only way he'll ever move forward. The next few days blur by in a haze of uncertainty. Greg checks out of his apartment, packs a few things into his car, and starts driving, just driving. He doesn't have a plan, doesn't know exactly where he's going, but he knows he can't stay in the place where everything fell apart. As the days pass, something inside him begins to shift. He's not healed, not by a long shot, but he's learning how to cope. The anger is still there, but it's no longer consuming him. He's focusing on himself now, on figuring out what comes next. He makes calls to friends he hasn't spoken to in years, reconnecting with the people who've always been there for him, even if he never realized it. He starts to take small steps toward rebuilding the life he once had, the life he thought he'd lost forever. A few months later, Greg stands on the balcony of his new apartment, looking out over the city as the sun sets. He's not exactly where he thought he'd be, but he's okay with that. He's learning to embrace the uncertainty of life. He thinks about Lisa from time to time, but the sting has faded. He knows it'll never be the same between them, but he's okay with that. He's stronger now, more resilient. He's learned that life doesn't always go the way we plan, and that's okay. In the end, Greg realizes that it wasn't the betrayal that broke him. It was the belief that he needed someone else to define his happiness. He doesn't need anyone but himself to be whole. And that's the lesson he'll carry with him, wherever he goes next. As he takes one last look at the sunset, he smiles. He doesn't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, he feels like he's finally ready to face it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this journey of discovery and personal growth. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories. Let me know in the comments what you think of Greg's journey, and if you've ever been in a similar situation. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay tuned for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.